A U.S. fighter jet has been shot down over Iran, and the search for the pilot is currently underway. Meanwhile, Iran is consolidating its control over the Strait of Hormuz, and France, together with China and Russia, is voting against reopening that very Strait of Hormuz by military means. In addition, Iran apparently has significantly more missiles than originally thought, but we want to talk about that, as well as everything else there is to report, here in this situation report on the Iran war.
Holy smokes, now save the most at holy with my code.
The Israelis report that they have attacked the general staff of Atesh. Atesh are the regular armed forces, which have 3 branches, just like the Revolutionary Guards themselves. So far, we've seen that Atesh has been relatively spared. Of course, their air defense was attacked, their air force was attacked, and their navy was attacked. But we haven't seen large-scale attacks against Atesh themselves, probably because there's hope that in the event of an uprising, parts of the regular army would defect to the insurgents. And of course, you don't want to have attacked them heavily beforehand. It's too soon to tell if this marks the start of a campaign against Atesh. We'll monitor this in future editions. But if this were to begin, it would probably be a sign that the Israelis have reached the point where they no longer believe that a regime change is still conceivable in any way, and that they would then proceed accordingly to destroy Iran's general military capabilities. In addition, they show videos where they attack air defenses in Tehran, and we can see here that they are placed on the tops of buildings. In order to have a greater range in the cities, of course, and to increase the radar horizon. We've already seen fire here, which I find quite interesting, because we can see here, just before the impact, this is a Zu-23-2 anti-aircraft gun. That's an anti-aircraft cannon, a 23mm machine cannon, which is obviously placed on the roof of a building here to take on anti-aircraft duties from there. The US is also attacking, and we can see various attacks here. And this seems to have been a Shahed 191 that gets hit here. We can clearly see that it's probably a flying wing that was hit here. Here we probably have another air defense system, but I couldn't identify it exactly. And this should be a Cub system, a Soviet-Russian Cub system. But what's interesting is that one of the missiles is pointing diagonally towards the sky. It doesn't seem ready for action, since that's not standard. Either a mistake happened there, or they set up a damaged system as a decoy, as an alternative target. So here, we can see that the attack is also continuing there, that the air defense is still being targeted, and that targets are still being engaged where it's not entirely clear to what extent they actually pose a threat. Because, as I said, for example, with the Shahed 191, it's not clear at this point whether it really still needs to be a priority. Then we have attacks on the arms industry, which of course are also continuing, and meanwhile, the spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry is complaining because a Winglong was shot down over Iran. The Winglong is a Chinese-made drone operated by Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, but not by either of the 2 main warring parties against Iran. Of course, that isn't without a certain comic irony. When Iran attacks the southern neighboring states every day, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, that they then use a drone, which at the time it was shot down, there are even larger images, was carrying no weapons at all. So it was possibly only on a reconnaissance mission. That makes the outrage seem a bit misplaced. In addition, there was an attack in Tehran on a large bridge. Apparently, this is the highest bridge in West Asia that was hit here, and we can see parts of it collapsing. We also have a series of recordings here that show us that the bridge was massively damaged, or that the crossing was effectively destroyed. Of course, we can only guess whether it was intentional to hit only the key points so that repairing it at a later time might be easier. In general, it must also be said that attacking bridges is legitimate in itself. In this case, it was a US attack, not an Israeli one, and bridges are undoubtedly legitimate targets. They enable, and therefore also allow, the transport of soldiers and weapons. So they are practically the dual-use target par excellence. Where bridges are built, they are necessary to cross certain topographical obstacles. And of course, these must be crossed by weapons and soldiers as well. That's why bridges are always one of the primary military targets. especially when you want to reduce the enemy's freedom of movement in the rear area. There's an explanation about this from the journalist Barak Rawit, who works for CNN among others, and for Axios. And he says that rockets for launches were being transported there. Of course, I can't say how true that is. But basically, as I said, I see the attack on a bridge as relatively unproblematic. From a military point of view, yes. From a political point of view, it becomes a bit more problematic. Because here, of course, an attack on a bridge is also an attack on infrastructure that serves the Iranians themselves. And with that, the Iranians themselves, so to speak, are directly affected, and that will certainly be used. As an argument, you see, they're not just attacking the forces that oppress us, but they're attacking our very livelihood. And theoretically, that should weaken the opposition and further discredit them. So in this respect, it might be militarily appropriate, but politically unwise. Then the big news today is certainly that a US F-15E Strike Eagle has been lost. According to reports, it was shot down. The Iranians have also reported the shootdown. The aircraft has 2 crew members, a pilot and a weapons systems officer. And the Iranians have published photos of the wreckage. Among other things, the unit has already been identified. A picture of the ejection seat that was found has also been published, so at least one of the pilots was able to eject alive. And there are recordings, and that's what's really impressive. We have footage here from US CSR units. So, combat search and rescue. Here, we see 2 Black Hawk helicopters flying over Iran itself, and they are there to search for the pilots, to search for the crew, and to rescue them. And it's not just the helicopters in action. Here we see a C-130 Hercules. So, a transport aircraft flying at extremely low altitude over Iranian territory. And this aircraft is also involved. The main task here is probably aerial refueling. And here we even have footage where it was actually filmed over Iran itself, showing it refueling the helicopters. Because of course, they only have a limited range, but in theory, they're supposed to stay on site as long as it takes to find the pilots. And here we can see them flying in formation with the C-130 to be refueled there. According to reports, the whole thing was also accompanied by an A-10. It was also photographed flying at low altitude over Iran itself. I couldn't verify the photo, so it's possible that this is a false report. But what's interesting is the weapon loadout, because the only thing I can see are 2 M9 Sidewinders. These are short-range air-to-air missiles. Other than that, nothing. No precision munitions for ground targets, which you would expect so that it could provide air support against ground targets. From my point of view, that might suggest that it just came from Iraq, where it may have flown missions against drones or the PMF militias. The A-10 is a ground attack aircraft with high loiter time, meaning it can stay in the air for a long duration, so it can actively respond. And of course, if one of our own aircraft is shot down and the pilots go missing, then the focus is on how to get them support as quickly as possible. And that would explain why an A-10 showed up here without the weapons load you would normally expect. It probably had the AIM-9 Sidewinder on board, just in case it needed to shoot down drones. Of course, the whole thing is a race against the Iranians. Tasnim, which is a news agency of the Revolutionary Guards, is publishing pictures and videos here showing their own forces searching for the pilots. We see a lot of men running around here. This is supposed to show the search for the pilots who were reported missing. And at that time, the good news was that one of the 2 crew members had already been found. He is in stable condition, which is an indication that he may be injured. But often pilots are also simply injured during ejection, because of course that's a huge strain on the body. And especially the parachute landing always carries a high risk of injury. The second crew member, that's the weapons systems officer, is still missing. He has not been found at this point, at least not by the end of the investigation. And we have to imagine what is actually happening here, where our own fighter jets are being shot down, where the enemy actually has a functioning way to shoot down supersonic aircraft, even when they're flying at high altitude. There, U.S. Special Forces operate with slow helicopters and cumbersome transport planes to rescue their comrades, to prevent them from being taken prisoner of war or even worse things happening to them. So, where others flee, these people rush in. In Bavaria they say, and forgive me for the somewhat crude language, but in Bavaria they say, they've got balls. Technically, it's in their underwear. On missions, comfort and avoiding chafing is crucial. I can't confirm if U.S. Special Forces use today's sponsor, but if you want to play it safe with socks or underwear during an infiltration behind enemy lines, today's sponsor can help you. A quick note on a topic men don't talk about, but that affects every one of you. You know the feeling. Boxer shorts that you have to adjust several times a day because they ride up. A waistband that starts to dig in after a few washes. Socks get holes after 8 weeks, but you keep buying the same 10-pack, thinking that's normal. It doesn't have to be. I've been wearing boxer shorts and sneaker socks from Snox for a while now, and the difference is immediately noticeable. The boxer shorts don't roll up. The waistband doesn't dig in. No scratchy tags. The sneaker socks don't slip and have a moisture-wicking strip. Both are made from GOTS-certified organic cotton, so no cheap materials. What convinced me? Snox offers a 12-month guarantee against holes. If something breaks within a year, you get a replacement. Simple. This isn't marketing. A manufacturer that bets on its own quality. And returns are currently free. And let's be honest, the next time you adjust your boxer shorts, remember, it doesn't have to be that way. Click the link in the pinned comment right below the video. It's the very first comment at the top. You get 20% off everything. No minimum purchase required. Returns are free. The warranty is 12 months. It costs you nothing to try it, but it costs you comfort every day not to. The only condition, the code only activates through the link. So, pinned comment, click on it, done. Meanwhile, the Iranians report that the commander of the Fatihim Special Unit has been killed. This is an elite unit of the Basij, which serves to secure the regime. And meanwhile, an opposition media outlet reports that Pezeshkian has effectively been stripped of power. As for the war, the president, who was elected by the people, has effectively lost control over the country. Revolutionary Guard officers have consolidated power, telling him that in wartime it can't be any other way, meaning they've taken full control. It is also reported again by Iran International, with the caveat that it is an opposition media outlet and therefore naturally has its own agenda, even though they are demonstrably well connected in Iran. They report that Pezeshkian is also being denied access to Mojtaba Khamenei by the Revolutionary Guard. That means, basically, we see that the Revolutionary Guard has consolidated power and the civilian government has, at least for the moment, been practically sidelined. We have already talked about this in the past, that Iran experts had identified exactly this as the likely outcome of a decapitation strike. As for the so-called axis of resistance, the shelling by Hezbollah, of course, continues. And for that, they released a video where they fired an anti-tank missile from inside a building. And we can also clearly see that it was probably a civilian building before. At least the mattresses in the background suggest that. Or that Hezbollah members were sleeping there. An anti-tank missile is being used there, and I'll fast forward a bit. We can see how it's flying towards an Israeli Merkava tank here. And this tank was apparently parked there, so its active protection system wasn't activated. That's here. Here's trophy, and we don't see any movement. That means, in this case, the hit was probably successful. The question, of course, is the effect. But because of the attack from above, which probably also bypassed this protective roof, this so-called cope cage, it could theoretically have been a total loss. Last time, I showed him a video where an attack by Hezbollah was probably repelled. In this case, it's plausible that it achieved its objective. Hezbollah also shot down an Israeli drone with a surface-to-air missile. The type is unknown. Of course, man-pads would be the obvious choice. The Israeli advance in Lebanon is currently faster than during the last offensive. And an expert on the ground says that this points to a weaker Hezbollah. That would, of course, correspond to the reality on the ground. We talked about how the Israelis have significantly weakened Hezbollah over the past 2.5 years. And in addition, Hezbollah itself has lost ground in Lebanon itself. That there may have been certain measures taken by the Lebanese government, which were not widely known, to disarm Hezbollah. The Lebanese government had decided on this, even though the evidence that it is being implemented was somewhat limited. It is reported that the buffer zone is supposed to be 2 to 3 kilometers wide. All houses in this area are being demolished. At least that's the somewhat good news. Because originally, something was said by the Israeli defense minister that gave the impression they would practically take over the entire south of Lebanon. Now it's only about up to 3 kilometers. Of course, it has to be said that on one hand, there's a political component, and on the other hand, a military one. Let's start with the military aspect first. The settlements along the border used to be observation posts for Hezbollah in the past. In 2023, countless weapons depots and staging areas were also found there. Hezbollah had bunkers, tunnel systems, and so on in that area to prepare for an invasion of Israeli territory. So the infrastructure was there to enable an invasion, especially by the Radwan forces. That still doesn't make it legal under international law to destroy every civilian house. Which brings us to the political aspect. The Israelis are being fired upon mainly from 20 kilometers and deeper inside Lebanon, not just from 2 kilometers away. We've discussed before that some areas of Lebanon are much higher in elevation than Israel, and from there, of course, anti-tank missiles, for example, can be fired into Israel. But that's by no means the case everywhere. The fact that a 2 to 3 kilometer wide buffer zone is being established here is certainly meant to send a message to the government in Beirut to disarm Hezbollah, because the Israelis are making it clear that this time they want to see Hezbollah disarmed, one way or another. And one of their methods, besides the slow advance, is to drastically increase the pressure on Beirut so that the Lebanese government does this with its own forces, which of course means that the Israelis don't have to do it themselves. Meanwhile, the Israelis are also attacking Hezbollah's financial system. The logic is simple. Not everyone is an ideologue and fanatic who fights whether they get paid or not. Some of the Hezbollah fighters do it for money, and if their financial system is attacked, they can't maintain that anymore. That's what happened here. And at the same time, the Houthis are reporting rocket fire from Israel. Here, too, reports continue to be confirmed. So the Houthis are now regularly firing at Israel, after they have now entered the war. Let's move on to the naval war itself. There, damages in Bandar Abbas were identified by satellite. And in the process, warehouses have been destroyed on a large scale. We can see here how severe the hits were, especially up here, for example, that the warehouses were attacked where there were probably mines, possibly also other anti-fiber materials, anti-ship weapons, and possibly, of course, speedboats that may have been stored there on land. Meanwhile, Iran reports attacks on the ports on the islands along the strait to the Persian Gulf, and this has also been captured by satellite. And you can see here that, for example, a fire has broken out on Keshem. What you see here the cargo ships are just passing through. This is basically used as Iran's customs checkpoint. The Iranians are currently forcing all cargo ships that coordinate with them to pass through this area, and attacks have been carried out there. Warehouses were also hit in the process. OSINT analysts saw this based on the identified fires. So they also want to undermine the ability to maintain this customs checkpoint there. However, the Iranian system is still functioning. For example, the Filipinos report here that they have negotiated with Iran to be allowed to use the strait. And the French have obviously done this as well, because a French container ship was able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which would naturally seem a bit surprising at first glance, since the French are allies of the Americans. Currently, we see that Iran is effectively establishing and consolidating control over the Strait of Hormuz. With the negotiations, the negotiating nations are acknowledging the situation. So every nation currently negotiating with Iran is saying, okay, Iran is the controller. That's who controls Hormuz. We have to talk to them. And here we need to understand what an important political significance this has, because this is the first step toward achieving de jure recognition. By forcing states to negotiate with it in order to use an international waterway, Iran is establishing a precedent that could later allow it to consolidate control. And the Iranians have made it very clear that this is exactly what they want to do in the future. Not least for this reason, several Gulf states wanted a UN Security Council resolution that would have legitimized all necessary means to guarantee civilian shipping. However, Russia, China, and France vetoed it. That means not only Russia and China, but also France vetoed the resolution that would have basically legitimized the Gulf states and the rest of the international community to use military force if necessary to fight to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. So the security resolution was rejected by France, which effectively meant recognition of control instead of fighting to keep it open. Here, France basically acknowledged that Iran controls the strait, and not only did it decline to vote in favor in order to support its allies in the Gulf, but France, together with Russia and China, voted against this resolution. The Iranians are consolidating control, and here we have a list of ship passages. We see that before the war began, we had 132 and 128, and on the first day of the war, it's only about 100. And after that, it sometimes collapses completely. And we see that it's slowly increasing again in the last few days. And that's precisely because the Iranians are increasingly negotiating, and nations are increasingly negotiating with them to be able to use the strait again. Now, 2 VLCCs have also passed through. Very large crude carriers, so 2 very large oil tankers and 1 LNG tanker have passed through. These actually passed through south of the customs area. How much of a breakthrough this was, or to what extent this was still coordinated with the Iranians, I can't say at the moment. Meanwhile, Trump is threatening, and we also have footage here showing that refueling in the Red Sea is massively increasing, since the Saudis have started up the pipeline there. Meanwhile, Trump is threatening to stop arms deliveries to Ukraine if the Europeans don't help out in Hormuz. That was somewhat to be expected. We've talked about this in the past, that Trump won't just accept that the Europeans aren't helping him in this war. This needs to be emphasized again here. The Europeans have no obligation in this regard, at least not towards the USA. NATO has nothing to do with it. This was a war that the USA decided to enter. We can now argue about how far it was geopolitically necessary, or because of Iran's behavior, but at least legally, that's the case. There's no reason or obligation for the Europeans to help. Whether that would make sense politically is another story. And here we see that Trump is quite obviously saying, quid pro quo, if you don't help us, then I don't feel like helping you anymore. How far this will actually be carried out is, of course, another story, because the arms deliveries to Ukraine are not free. The Europeans are paying for them. And the fact that Trump is willing to forego this money flowing into the US is, of course, a question that has not yet been clarified. Meanwhile, Iran is, of course, still firing. Here we have a video, for example, of a strike in Israel, where we can see one of the rockets arriving and hitting in Israel. And overall, from April 1st to April 2nd, within 24 hours, 20 rockets were launched by Iran. This is one of the larger salvos that have occurred so far. That means we can see that Iran is gradually consolidating its ability to launch rockets again. But it is also firing at Kuwait. What stands out here? 2 cruise missiles were used. And the next day, again, 2 cruise missiles and 7 ballistic missiles, along with numerous drones, of course. A power plant and a desalination facility were also hit. They are usually together there on the Gulf, because desalination facilities naturally require a lot of energy. So it makes sense to build them together with a power plant. So if a power plant is right by the sea, there's usually a desalination facility there as well. So it's not necessarily a direct attack on the desalination facility, even though, effectively, it is one and will be understood as such. Interestingly, Iran says it was Israel, as if you couldn't obviously see on the radar where the rockets and drones are coming from. And as far as I know, of course the Kuwaitis have also clearly said that it was the Iranians and not Israel. Bahrain is also still being attacked. In this case, however, it was only drones, but Qatar is also being attacked. Here too, drones were used again. Qatar had a few days of calm after Donald Trump had issued massive threats following the attack on the gas field, on the LNG facility in Qatar. And the attacks are also continuing against the United Arab Emirates. And here we can see that the number of ballistic missiles there has noticeably increased again. And again, cruise missiles are involved here. So we can see that Iran is now gradually bringing out its cruise missiles. My personal theory is, as I said, I can't prove it to you, but it was surprising from the beginning why so few cruise missiles were used. I've mentioned this in various places, that actually a few hundred Iranian cruise missiles should be missing. The Iranian cruise missiles were disappointing from the Iranians' point of view when they were used against Israel last year. And I suspect that the Iranians were aware of this and therefore decided to hold them back until the air defense was weakened by the consumption of ammunition in fighting drones and ballistic missiles. A cruise missile's main advantage is its much larger warhead compared to a drone, so if you get the enemy to use most of their air defense ammunition to shoot down relatively harmless drones, that is, drones with relatively small weapon payloads, and then later you send in cruise missiles, which have a much larger explosive charge, then that makes sense to some extent. And it could be that this is the case now, that we will see more and more cruise missiles in the coming days. Because actually, as I said, Iran should have several hundred of them, and overall, we've only seen a few dozen so far, probably not even 50 at this point. Then we have reports that a gas facility was also hit in the United Arab Emirates. Pieces fell down here after the air defense intercepted something there. It's also interesting that, at least in part, I've seen some questions about this, which we can briefly clarify here. When debris crashes into a target in Ukraine, it's often laughed at, because mainly drones are used there, especially by the Ukrainian side. It's a bit different with ballistic missiles, because just because they're shot down doesn't mean the debris doesn't keep flying toward the target due to inertia, unless the interception has knocked them far off course. Also, interception of ballistic missiles usually happens relatively late with most systems, especially with Patriot or similar ones. Normally, just a few seconds before impact, and so the amount of time debris has to veer off course is also somewhat reduced. And especially when larger facilities are targeted, like a gas plant or something similar, which can easily be 1 or 2 kilometers long, then it's absolutely realistic that debris will hit, even if an interception was actually successful. It's significantly less likely that it was actually a successful interception when we're talking about cruise missiles or drones. But it's no wonder that the attacks continue. We can see here that the attacks are stabilizing to some extent. I'll turn off the camera for a moment so you can see it here. So we can see that the attacks are now more or less at a much lower level than at the beginning of the war, but that the attacks have more or less stabilized, at around 40 missiles more or less. Sometimes we have 50, but sometimes we also have 25. But most of the time, it's about 40 rockets that have been fired recently, and actually even more than the week before. And with the drones as well, we're clearly seeing stabilization, albeit at a low level. And that shouldn't be surprising, because we've now received the news that US intelligence agencies say that Iran probably still has 50% of its tells. So, 50% of the launch vehicles it needs to launch ballistic missiles may still be available. I've reported here in the past that Israelis and Americans have sometimes claimed they had already destroyed 70 to 80%. That doesn't seem to be true. It's also being reported that thousands of drones are still left. That's not surprising. Or at least, that's not surprising. We've been assuming that here on the channel for a while now. Of course, rocket launches themselves can also go wrong sometimes. Here we have a recording where we can see it, from Tehran. And there we can see how the rocket crashes to the ground and possibly causes damage there. In this case, that's something that naturally happens as well. We can see it here. Based on the smoke trail, it was launched there and had some kind of malfunction and crashed nearby. We already had something like this, I think, in Bahrain as well, although in that case it was an anti-aircraft missile. So that also happens and shouldn't really be surprising. As I said, the drones themselves are not a surprise. We can assume that Iran should have had thousands. Actually, a 5-digit number of drones at the beginning of the war. As for the tell, it was of course announced many times that most of them had been destroyed. This is a sobering realization by the US intelligence services at this point. And with that, we come to a conclusion. What was expected has happened. The US has lost a combat aircraft. I said this at the beginning of the war. Especially if the whole thing lasts longer, it's simply a matter of time. That's just the law of averages. On the one hand, combat aircraft are machines that are designed to operate at their limits. And that's why they generally have a certain crash rate, which is much higher than, I don't know, compared to large commercial airplanes, simply because they're pushed to the limit more often. And on the other hand, Iran had hundreds of air defense systems at the beginning of the war, many of which, as you could certainly argue, were very poor, with problems in communication, radar surveillance, and so on everywhere. And the problems probably got even worse. But the fact that shootdowns happened over time shouldn't really have been a surprise. While the aircraft themselves, as I said, are old, many of those used are. This particular aircraft, I believe I read somewhere, is supposed to be over 30 years old. A technical malfunction can't be completely ruled out, so we might eventually learn it was caused by one. However, with an aircraft that has 2 engines, it's somewhat less likely, and being shot down over enemy territory is, of course, more likely at this point. Given the number of missions the Israelis and Americans are currently flying, it's actually impressive that this is the first shootdown over Iran. Of course, there have also been friendly fire shootdowns. That was over Kuwait and the heavily damaged F-35, which was also hit by the Iranians. But the fact that we now have the first total loss over Iran is somewhat impressive, considering the overall numbers. France's dealings with Iran mean that France is negotiating with Iran to use the Strait of Hormuz. Although it is allied with the United Arab Emirates in Iran and has a military base there, that is of course quite telling. At least in France, it is obvious that people believe a hard line against Iran is not sensible right now. That weakens the US and the Gulf states and strengthens Iran's position. You simply have to acknowledge that at this point. A vote for the Bahraini proposal would not have required any military involvement from the French. It would have created some moral obligation for them, but not forced them. But of course, it would have meant that the French could no longer negotiate with the Iranians afterward about whether their ships could pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Even an abstention would have been better in that context than rejecting it. Because if the demand is that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open and that the states bordering an international waterway cannot simply be cut off from it, then that should actually be something worth supporting. But France decided differently here. Meanwhile, Iran still has the expected capability to deploy long-range drones. But the barrage of rockets shouldn't stop anytime soon either, if they still have 50% of their launch vehicles. Because having so many launch vehicles left, but hardly any rockets, seems rather unlikely. Especially since TELs can theoretically be rebuilt. Although it's more complex than welding a few frames onto a truck, that's still the basic foundation. A truck remains a truck, even if you add stabilizers, hydraulics, targeting systems, and electronics. Even if those still need to be installed, at least in theory, it's possible that Iran could build more of them. Although I don't have any data to confirm that they still can. It's also interesting that the U.S. Secretary of Defense has fired several generals. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff do not have operational control. Instead, they act in an advisory, planning, or coordinating capacity. It should be said here that this was obviously dissatisfaction on Hegseth's part with the respective generals, whether it was because the predictions regarding the Iranian response were not accurate, or because ground troops were not preemptively deployed, or because the general or generals spoke out against ground operations that are now supposed to take place. Theoretically, it's also possible that they have to serve as scapegoats here, but that would actually have to be accompanied by major explanations, which in turn would be bad for morale. We can also picture a situation where they're dismissed now, and after the war, it's explained they were fired for incompetence. As I said, we'll have to wait and see. But at this point, we have to say that until we have the details with the exact reasoning, the assessment is purely political because we have to guess. Why Hegseth is dismissing people right now is something we can only guess at the moment, as long as we don't have a comprehensible explanation. And of course, we must not forget that Hegseth could also give a false reason for why he dismissed them. So at this point, any final explanations like, this happened because of this or that, would simply be political. And that's why I'll refrain from giving them here. I just tried to explain to you the significance of the general staff there. Also, don't forget, whether you're planning an infiltration behind enemy lines, just want to do sports, or just be in the office, Snox gives you 20% off the entire range with the pinned link. That's today's situation report. Please give a thumbs up to help the algorithm and leave a comment if you have something to add. If you're new, please subscribe and click the bell to get notified of future videos. The next live stream is tomorrow Saturday at 8 p.m. German time. There, of course, we'll do a situation report on the war in Ukraine, on the war in the Persian Gulf, followed by a Q&A session. That means if you have any burning questions after watching this video, I hope I can answer them for you tomorrow. That's all for now from Torsten Heinrich. Thank you for your attention and see you soon. Thanks also to the supporters on Patreon, and I would especially like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori and the Lieutenants Pertainment, Robert Viel, Lichtschädler, Anti-X, Meersmann, Malermeister, Nagel, Markus P., Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Vision, Soundlab, Zigrider, Silvio Ströver, Möter 1000 Jan SQ, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Eustres, Shadow, Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Frem, Nickname 2Bip, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42. Thank you. This wouldn't be possible without you.